What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Canadian Football Fanatics, and thank you for tuning in to another video. Blake and I back at it again to talk some BC Lions football. We are just days away from the CFL free agency officially opening, although the tampering window, Ed Harvey tampering window, whatever we're going to call it, has been open now for a few days, and signings are coming. I guess, agreed to terms, I guess, is probably the official
Yeah.
statement. Although none of these contracts have been officially signed, we're starting to see some of these news being broken on social media. And it's been a lot of fun to. I was chatting with JC of, once you get past the holidays and Christmas, it's kind of like you take that deep breath and really take some time away from football. And then free agency comes in. It's like, free agency and the combine and the draft and football season will be here before we know it. So, as always, I'm joined by my main man, Blake. Blake, thanks for joining me, buddy. How you doing?
Yeah, doing good. It's kind of crazy to think about, like you were just saying, like feels like just yesterday that you and I were doing this almost the exact same show. And then like after the start of free agency, and then we did the combine show, we did our mock draft, and then all of a sudden training camp was here. You and I were up in Kamloops, and the whole season flew by, and here we are again. So it's crazy how fast time flies.
It's crazy, Blake, actually, now that you bring that up. It's probably close to about a year to the day we rebranded to the Canadian Football Fanatics. And just crazy the kind of the growth, everything, in just the short amount of time, a year that we've came, and as you said as well, just how fast time's flown. We're in the hustle and bustle of free agency here, but before we know it, training camp will be here, the preseason, and we'll be into the regular season before we know it. So, Blake, like I was saying, buddy, BC Lions, we're kind of struggling with making the thumbnail here behind the scenes, taking you guys behind the curtain. What we're gonna call this episode? I'm not too sure if it's BC Lions free agency breakdown, because it's not quite a breakdown. Nothing officially has happened quite yet. A preview, not too sure we're gonna call it a preview, but basically a BC Lions free agency discussion or extravaganza frenzy. Where me and Blake are going to kind of discuss some of the bigger names that have been signed. The Matthew Betts, the Justin McInnises, even include Mr. Automatic Sean White in there, Gary Peters, some of the bigger name guys. We'll talk about some of the quieter signings that maybe Blake and I like as well. And then kind of go into, some of the guys that we might not be seeing back in a BC Lions jersey. We got some news yesterday. Mike Couture got re-signed to the team, but there's still guys out there. David Mackey's, Suk Chung's that still aren't signed. So still TBD if we're going to see them back in BC Lions jersey. So it should be a good discussion between Blake and I here today. All BC Lions. And before we get into that, Blake, as always, like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, subscribe. I think we're at 299, Blake, so we can punch down that
Let's
wall to
do it.
300.
300.
That would be fantastic. Before we get into it, I guess we should kind of give some news because this will be dropping on Monday, the day before free agency officially opens, if I'm not mistaken. Correct, Blake? I believe it opens that
Correct.
Tuesday
Tuesday,
at 9
9
a.m.
a.m. or something. Is it
Eastern, I
Eastern or
believe.
Pacific?
It could be
I
noon
think it's
Eastern. Not
noon Eastern,
okay, and it'd be 9 a.m. Excuse me, our time.
our time.
With that being said, though, we are going to be in a little bit of a transition period this year. A small announcement. Nothing is changing too much, but on behalf of Blake and I, Shane with 13th Man Football, and of course Coach Phil, the weekly show this year is going to be moving to 13th Man Football platform with Shane. So Shane's going to be hosting the weekly shows this year. If you guys are accustomed to those and tuned in last year, we did a weekly show every Wednesday night throughout the regular season. And of course, we're going to be covering, the big things like free agency when it opens, combine, and so on and so forth throughout the offseason as well. We are officially going to be doing our first show on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Once again, that's going to be on the 13th Man Football YouTube channel. And it should be a ton of fun. You can expect the same kind of content, same kind of style, where we're going to go through the whole league as a whole. Of course, there's going to be a good amount of discussion with the BC Lions, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and Ottawa Redblacks. Of course, all three of our teams that are represented by us. But that being said, we kind of include all things of Canadian football as well. I'm sure Shane's going to want to include some of the CJFL in there with his OFC and whatnot, us with the BCFC, and of course U Sports in there as well. I know Shane's been, talking very highly of Taylor Elgisma. Of course, we have as well. Us covering the Canada West, I'm sure maybe Shane will like to tie in maybe the OUA and stuff like that into it as well. But with that, Blake, just what are your feelings? Are you excited, buddy? Nothing, I guess, really to kind of change, like I said, but just a new, platform for us to talk Canadian football on a weekly basis.
Yeah, no, definitely excited. I know you've mentioned that you kind of want to not really take a step back, but maybe go into different directions. And I'm so happy for you that you're moving into different stuff in the BCFC, hopefully, and with the VI Raiders and stuff like that. So I think that it just proves that we're growing each and every day, and that's spearheaded by you. I like to joke sometimes that even though we're co-hosts, you run a lot of stuff, you do a lot of the prep, and you just tell me to show up, and I show up there. So no, really, you've done a lot of the hard work, and I'm happy to be kind of riding your coattails as much as I can.
Of course, buddy. We couldn't. I couldn't do this without you, my man. So, like Blake was saying, I will be for the most part on the show throughout the off season, but once it gets into the regular season, I'm not too sure how much appearances I'll be on there. I'll at least try for once every other week kind of thing. You'll see me at least on a monthly basis, at least a couple times. But for the most part, Blake is going to be representing the Canadian Football Fanatics on the weekly show once the regular season comes around. So should be a good, fun time. But Blake, do not forget about us, folks, because the BC Lions coverage is going nowhere, and that is starting with this video. Um, Blake and I will continue to do our same thing all year long, and that's why we're going to kind of take a small step back with hosting the weekly show and try to, put a little bit more responsibilities on Shane's plate. And you and I are going to really focus in on, making
Mhm.
sure we're doing a post-game show, a preview show, and of course, when any sort of news happens, we're doing a video. And that brings us to our free agency extravaganza, frenzy, whatever we're going to call it here, Blake. Let's get into it, my man. And I know we were back. We did a off-season primer,
We did,
and
yeah.
we were doing some discussions around, Matthew Betts and Justin McInnis. Those guys still were unsigned, and we had Nick Kowalski join us a few weeks ago, mostly talking about Arrow Up. I know we were discussing a few other BC Lions specific topics, but really haven't had a chance for me and you to really just hash out some of the moves that have been made, this, the decisions that have been going on behind the scenes. And I think that should start with one Matthew Betts. I think this is a good conversation for both you and I to have because I think we feel similarly on the player, but maybe had a little bit of a different, I think maybe opinion on kind of, the way I guess we think it should have been handled. I don't even think it should have been handled, just the way I guess things could have went. And that started with me, and I mentioned that with JC, who you guys are going to see in probably about 30 minutes time. Um, of I understand the player Matthew Betts and how great he is, and that's not an argument. And I think something that JC kind of talked me a little bit into as well is just the ratio breaking aspect of him being Canadian. JC also, I think, kind of talked me into him getting back to that 2023 form that he was in a season ago. There was, a pause for hesitation coming into the offseason of, we didn't really see that form of Matthew Betts that we did in 2023. I think JC made, many good points, as well as you did, I think, a few times as well, of, you're not going to just come back in from the NFL and instantly pick up right where you left off. So
Mhm.
I think giving him a time to hopefully, regain to that status, that playing level, hopefully in off season we'll get him back up to that standard. And I think at the money, I believe it's 260 k in 2025, 270k in 2026. JC also reminded me you kind of have to pay some of the, a little bit of extra sometimes with that Canadian ratio aspect of, he's a Canadian, he's going to be able to play those ratio snaps for you and provide elite level snaps. I think it's you know I'm on board a little bit more than I was, and I know I was boisterous to begin the offseason, Blake, of maybe leaning towards bringing back Matthew Betts, looking elsewhere on the roster to upgrade to spend that money, I guess. That being said, Blake, now that I've kind of came around to things a little bit more, we know Matthew Betts is going to be coming back to this defense. I think that something also you and I agreed upon coming into the offseason is that we thought Christian Covington might take another step, and that losing a guy like Matthew Betts, maybe Christian Covington would come into his own a year into the CFL. We talked about it all year, all season long of, wanting more and expecting more from Christian Covington, but not really understanding. He mentioned in the media of, how much quicker the game was that he thought it was, and just getting adjusted to the Canadian Football League. Probably should have gave him a little bit more of a break than we did. We were obviously very critical of him. I think he's only going to take another step going into next season. I think that'll help Matthew Betts to regain his level of form that we saw in 2023, because teams are going to demand, maybe having to pay attention to Christian Covington or maybe Matthew Betts, and that leaves one or the other to have a one-on-one opportunity to hopefully get some pressure on the quarterback. So, Blake, now that it's official, we have Matthew Betts under contract for 2 more years in a BC Lions uniform, buddy. What are just your thoughts on Matthew Betts returning?
Yeah, I think I'm happy about it generally. I kind of agree with you that I was a little bit worried about Betts after the season that he had last year. But you got to remember that he was down at NFL camp till basically touchdown Pacific. Like him and Nathan Rourke were very similar. I believe Rourke came back 2 weeks before Betts. So Betts was one of the final cuts of, I believe it was the Detroit Lions that he was with. Do I have that correct? Yeah,
Correct, Blake.
he,
Yep.
he was he was one of the final cuts of the Detroit Lions. He came back for touchdown Pacific, and I'm sure that Betts won't admit it. I'm sure that the Lions won't admit it. But when you come from training camp in the NFL and you come straight back to the CFL, you're probably going to be dealing with, at the very least, nicks and bruises that he probably played through the entire season. So I do agree that Matthew Betts can return to that 2023 form. And I think that the thing that gives me the most hope for that he will be able to return to that 2023 form is that in 2022, he was no slouch either. He had 10 plus sacks that season before he broke the Canadian record in 2023. So that 2022 season really propelled him into the 2023 season. So he's proven that he can be a great rush end in the CFL. I believe he also possibly had 10 plus sacks when he was with the Elks as well. So he has constantly had 10 plus sacks in the CFL. And I think give him a full off season, give him a full training camp, he will be very close to, if not fully at, that 2023 level Matthew Betts.
Yeah, well said. I really like that point of you bringing up 2022 as well with the BC Lions having a season under his belt where he had proven production. Obviously, not the season that he had in 2023, but what, two Canadians ever have had seasons like
Yeah.
that. So, a hard thing to do in itself. So, I'm interested to see. I think I've coming around to it a little bit more as yourself has as well. And ultimately, Blake, I think we're both in agreement of we just want to see Matthew Betts doing good things in a BC Lions
Mhm.
uniform, and I think he'll get back up to that level we saw a few seasons ago. So let's continue to go with kind of, I guess, further back signings, Blake, and we'll work our way forward in the current time here. And I want to start with a guy that I actually didn't ask JC about, but I know you and I both big fans of him. Number one, familiar with his story here, being a BC boy, but Sean White, Mr. Automatic,
Mhm.
re-signs with the BC Lions, and some people might say, why the heck are we taking an opportunity to talk about a kicker? Well, that would be because it is one Mr. Automatic. As I said, Sean White, deserving of Special Teams Player of the Year for the last 2 seasons, I think you
Two
could
years
argue.
and he didn't win it either.
Yes. So that is why we are talking about Sean White. Now, why I want to have the conversation about Sean White, Blake, is obviously we are, I think, both fans of bringing back Sean White because number one, consistent kickers aren't, found on trees or aren't growing on
No.
trees, right? So having to go outside of your comfort zone to find a younger guy, obviously the grass isn't always greener on the other side. But I want to pivot this to you, Blake. I think my concerns now going forward, not that Sean White is going to fall off a cliff, because I think Sean White still has a few more seasons left in him. We've seen kickers age pretty gracefully because of the position, right? You're not really, banging too much in terms of physical contact, and you're able to kind of age a little bit more gracefully. We saw it with Louis. We saw it with Paul McCallum. I'm curious with you, Blake. You and I both had the opportunity, and hopefully everyone that's listening to this has had the opportunity to go watch Arrow Up back, and we got to see a little bit of Shaun White's offseason and him eating better and starting to train and stuff like that. And I was curious. I joked with Nick that I didn't know Shaun White used to be jacked back in the day when we saw that little flashback
Yeah.
picture of him working with, I believe it was Chris Boyko, one of the head athletic trainers back in the day for the BC Lions. My question to you, Blake, is how long do you think we can expect to see Shaun White at the level of play that he is? Unbelievable. I don't remember what his percentage was last year for field goals made, but up 90% and above, I believe, for
I
two
think it was
consecutive seasons in a
90, 91 or 92.
yeah. It was at least above 90% for the last two seasons in a row. As I mentioned, deservingly of the special teams player of the year in the CFL. Now, yes, you can argue Jarian Grant was very deserving of that as well. I think Shaun White's name was very validly in that conversation for what he was doing on the field. The consecutive field goals made streak that obviously came to an end was unfortunate for Shaun White. But how long do you think we can expect to see Shaun White in the form that we've been used to seeing him here in the last, what is it, 3 or 4 years that he's been back in BC?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know if I can really answer that question. Like, if you wanted the full answer, you would have to ask Sean himself. But I really like the point that you made that, like, he's at the kicker position, which, like, it's no disrespect to the kickers. It gives them longer longevity. Like, they're not really tackling, they're not really getting tackled, if ever. So we've seen it, as you said, with Paul McCallum, with Louis Pisaglia, with Shaun White now, who I believe, if he hasn't yet, is pushing 40. But I would say that, I mean, especially now that he has a wife and a young daughter and everything like that, I don't believe that Shaun White wants to play anywhere else in the CFL. So I think that we can expect Shaun White for however long he wants to play, whether that's this year, whether that's another 2 years, whether that's another 3 years. Maybe he wants to win another Grey Cup and then he'll call it a career. But I think the full on question would have to be answered by Sean. I would expect, though, at least 2 or 3 years from Shaun White before he hangs him up.
Who knows, Blake? Maybe that'll be a future upcoming guest that we can ask him ourselves of, Shaun, how much longer can you continue to put that ball through the uprights and do your job at a high level? Who knows, folks? If you guys would like to see Shaun on the pod, please leave a comment down below. We'd love to have Shaun on, and maybe it's in the works. But Blake, one other re-signing before we get into some of the other transactions the BC Lions have done, and that is, of course, how could we not talk about one Justin? Oh, we will talk about him. We will talk about him, but
No,
Justin
I
McInnis is who
meant
I
like
want to
the
talk.
number one receiver, but
That a boy. I thought you were talking about Gary Gary
no,
Gary
no, no,
Gary
no.
Peters. Justin McInnis re-signs. Now, I think both you and I probably are aligned on this more than the two, maybe not quite more aligned than the Shaun White one, but more aligned than Matthew Betts. Of you and I both wanted to see Justin McInnis back in a BC
Mm.
Lions jersey, no matter the price. We were both, content. If he was signing for 300K, it is what it is. We both wanted to see Justin McInnis back in BC. That's going to happen, and that's going to happen at 50K less than 300K. It's going to be 250K in 2025. I was listening. I'm not too sure if you had the opportunity yet, Blake, because I know you're busy throughout the week and busy on the weekends even as well, buddy. But the Three Down Nation podcast this week, they were talking about obviously all the teams' transactions and deals so far in free agency, and they talked about liking the contract and stuff like that, and obviously Justin McInnis, that I think they agreed upon of his arrow is only pointing up, his trajectory is
Mhm.
pointing upwards, but I think it was Justin Dunk that made the point of, you know, is he a bona fide number one receiver? Now, I think you and I, there's not a debate in that. I think we're going to
No.
see Justin McInnis step up to the plate once again and, answer the bell, if you will. They kind of mentioned, not really having much of a track record outside of this past season. Obviously, the prior season in BC was a solid one, but it was only, I think, maybe 500 or 600 yards. Was obviously started the season as a reserve receiver. Dominic Rhymes got hurt, if I remind you guys correctly. he kind of found that role very quickly and really stepped up to the plate. They mentioned of having some concerns of maybe him being a very good number two receiver and a kind of a 1B to a 1A type thing where you can have a 1A and a 1B kind of thing. But once the coverage kind of shifts to him and teams are, I was talking to JC about this. Once it's, week one and we're playing Calgary or Edmonton, whoever it's going to be, and the defensive coordinator goes into the film room and they put on the BC Lions film, it's going to be obviously Nathan Work number one, but then it's going to be number 18, Justin McInnis, and how are we going to stop him? How are we going to take away him from the BC Lions offense? And how are we going to make the BC Lions offense beat us without Justin McInnis? Now, personally, I don't know without talking to you, Blake. I feel like that he's going to be able to maintain the level of play that he had this past season. He's going to be able to answer the bell once teams, shift coverage towards him, put the best defender on him, whatever it may be that defensive coordinators think that they can do to take away Justin McInnis. I think he's going to be up to the task and still be able to perform. Is he going to lead the league in CFL receiving yards? I don't know, because there's fantastic receivers in the league that might have great seasons. Like there might be another Tyson Philpott season where, if I remind you guys, if he stays healthy, there's not. I just obviously football is football and things could happen. I just don't think Justin McInnis is probably catching Tyson Philpott if he stays healthy for the rest of the year. Now, obviously, the games had to be played, and we saw what happened. What about, I think of a guy like Bully Levi Mitchell, 5,000-yard passer from a season ago. He gets a guy like Kenny Lawler. Let's say Kenny Lawler, has a great season, or even Tim White, anybody in that Hamilton receiving core. Saskatchewan with Trevor Harris and some of those guys are going to have, another year under their belt to go off. In Winnipeg, it could be a number of good receivers. In Calgary with VA and Don Rhymes now. There could be a number of guys that end up leading the league where I think I feel comfortable at saying Justin McInnis will probably finish as, in that top 5 of receiving yards, touchdowns, and receptions. But Blake, what do you think is a fair expectation? And do you think that Justin McInnis is going to be able to live up to the contract as a number 1 receiver, not that, 1B to a 1A kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that he definitely is. And the point that I want to make is that we heard a lot as BC Lions fans that really from week 7, week 8, whatever the number was, that Justin McInnis was really shut down by opposing defenses, pardon me, last season. But that truly wasn't the case. I mean, no, Justin McInnis wasn't putting up the 200 yard games that he was early on in the year, which I believe he put up twice, but he was putting up 85, 90 yards, 100, 115, 110. And I was looking at these numbers and I was listening to all these different podcasts and 2 and Out and 3Down Nation, as you mentioned, and some of our other friends from Saskatchewan and stuff like that. And they were like, man, McInnis has been shut down. I'm like, he really hasn't. He's just quietly been going about his business, catching the ball. Has he had the touchdown numbers? No, maybe not. But he's been catching the ball. He's been getting big first downs. He's been doing his job. And he has gone over 1,000 yards this season. So I really do believe that if anything, it'll kind of be a 1A, 1B situation between him and Keon Hatcher, who I'm sure we're going to get to in a moment. But other than that, I would definitely not see Justin McInnis as anything lower than a number 2 receiver in the BC Lions. And really, if he'd gone anywhere else, I don't think he'd be anywhere lower than a number 2 receiver.
Yes, and as we mentioned with Matthew Betts, he is a ratio breaking player. He adds to the Canadian aspect of he counts towards the ratio. You can play him, and he is a darn good football player, regardless of where he's born or where his passport says he hails from. So I think it's just going to add as well, and maybe we'll talk about that as well in a little bit of our ratio flexibility with guys like Justin McInnis, Javon Catoy, Nathan Work on offense. That probably allows you with maybe transitioning into our next topic here, Blake, allows you to play maybe 3 American offensive linemen with obviously Joel Broxton will probably be one of them. Maybe Chris Slugger's another one. And then the addition of Dejon Allen from the Toronto Argonauts. And that's probably where we should go next, Blake, is the BC Lions, where in the headlines, I think this was probably maybe one of the farther transactions going back now.
Yeah, one of the first
really happened
moves of the
around
offseason.
Yeah, I think maybe towards the new year, because we recorded the offseason primer, I think maybe close to like 2 months now ago, where I know obviously the news of Buck Pierce and I think the VA trade had just happened.
It
I
had,
think
yeah.
maybe a few weeks after that is when we had the news of the Dejon Allen trade. And I think where it gives you flexibility now is now you can have confidence of, before we were playing, two or three Canadians along the offensive line. Now being able to have three Americans possibly freeing you up because you have a guy like Justin McInnis and Matthew Betts and stuff like that, the ratio breaking players to play some of those premium positions. Now you can kind of attack those other positions and utilize them with some Americans as well. So Dejon Allen ends up coming to the BC Lions for linebacker Ryder Varga and a second round pick from the BC Lions. And quickly on Ryder Varga, JC mentioned this as well. I think he is a very underrated player in the CFL, and I think he is gonna, start to flourish here and start to, I feel like he is a starting caliber player. I'm not gonna say he's a, an all-star or anything like that, folks, but you put him in there. Is he going to have some bad plays? Absolutely. But that just goes with the territory when you're playing against other professional athletes on the other side that are paid to make plays on the other side. But when Ryder Varga came in and stepped up, almost, a handful of times a game where you'd be like, man, who made that play? And it was like, that was freaking Ryder Varga that made that play on
Yeah.
defense. And it happened quite often where it was like, man, like this kid is only getting better. He was a kid that got drafted by the BC Lions, I think in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, went back to the University of Regina, came to the BC Lions in 2024 for the first time, I believe. And just like I said, I think his arrow is only going up. So we wish him well in Toronto. I'm curious to see where he's going to maybe fit in with a guy like Cam Judge, another Canadian. But I'm curious to see how that's going to work for them and where he'll be able to fit in. We lose a second round pick in 2026, so not this upcoming draft, next year, which is a bummer. But when you get a guy like Dejon Allen, who we're going to talk about now, regarded as kind of one of the better pass protecting offensive linemen in the CFL, or better pass protecting offensive tackles in the CFL, which is fantastic news. I'm sure there was nobody smiling bigger than one Nathan Rourke in BC when the news came across that we were getting a guy like Dejon Allen. Now you have two tackles that are, Jarrell Boxon, I don't think gets probably enough praise, but he is a very goes about his business, as you mentioned about Justin McInnis, and just does his job, punches the clock. Like I said, he's going to get beat from time to time because other guys on the other side of the ball get paid just like they do. But for the most part, Jarrell Broxton is very quietly, I think, a very solid piece, a very solid offensive lineman
Yep.
where he's going to get beat from time to time, but more often than not, he does his job as a left tackle. Having a right tackle and securing those edges on the offensive line, I think is just so important. But we've heard it now, Blake, for many years. I'm sure you're well aware of it too now, dating back to JC actually joked about, we've heard it now dating back to the Mike Riley era, which is, years ago at this point now, of having to get the offensive line right, of seeing season after season of Mike Riley on his back because of league leading sacks given up and whatnot. And we'd gotten better, I think, through some of those years and had made strides towards the right direction. But I think last year, people were definitely wanting to see a change and seeing the offensive line going in the right direction. I think this is a step in the right direction. Blake, what were your thoughts when you see the trade come across that the BC Lions were going to be landing one of the better offensive linemen in the CFL?
Yeah, I was very happy about it, as I do remember hearing that some of the Riders fans that were upset. I think rightfully, and I believe you agree with me as well, that Logan Furland was not named the lineman of the year last year, offensive lineman of the year for the CFL. Had actually pointed out that Allen had better overall stats, like the PFF and everything like that was better overall than the name escapes me, but the gentleman
Ryan
from
Hunter.
the Ryan Hunter that won the award for the Argos, Allen had better stats than him. So he was arguably the best CFL lineman for the entirety of the league last year. So that can only help your offensive line when you can get someone like that. Unfortunate that we did have to lose Ryder Varga, but you and I being hockey fans as well, you kind of know that in order to get something good, you got to give up something good. So it's unfortunate. I wish Ryder the best of luck in Toronto. Hopefully the Argos don't go back to back, but he's going to a championship level team. and I think he's only going to flourish over there at BMO and over at the Argos.
Yeah, a few last things actually on Dejon Allen. I will remind folks as well, talking about being better than having some better numbers on PFF than Ryan Hunter this past season. Dejon Allen was actually the CFL's most outstanding offensive lineman in 2023, only 2 seasons ago. So has that, uh, you know, has numerous years under his belt of playing at that high level. We're not getting a guy that was a what's the term, a one-hit wonder, I guess, if you will, a guy that's proven doing this year after year at a high level. And as you said, you kind of have to give up something to get something good as well. And as you said there, with the championship, hopefully Ryder Varga, joking he doesn't get another championship and the Argos don't go back to back. He brings over that championship pedigree to the BC Lions locker room, which I think will help very much so. So, last, I guess we'll kind of just recap. We're going to talk about one signing, Blake, so don't think that I'm going to forget about it after a few of these questions coming up. But I'm going to quickly just go through some of the names that we did re-sign before we get into some of the losses here, Blake. And that's just going to go. I guess we'll start with some of the guys that we discussed already. But the BC Lions have already re-signed this offseason. Matthew Betts, defensive end. Sean White, kicker. Gary Peters, defensive back. Justin McInnis, receiver. Jordan Perryman, defensive back. Patrice Rene, a national defensive back. Thibaut Debaye, a global defensive tackle. Riley Pickett, a national long snapper slash fullback, kind of Swiss Army knife
Yeah.
for the team. Isaiah Messam, national linebacker as well. Friend of the program, Andrew Pearson, national offensive lineman. Chris Slugger, a American offensive lineman. Jalen Edwards Cooper, a cornerback. Marcus Moore, a defensive tackle. And then we got the news yesterday that Michael Couture also would be coming back to the Lions Den as well. So, Blake, we're going to get into probably a little bit more of a depressing conversation. Not a depressing conversation. That sounds too bad, but a more of a sad conversation because we're going to start to talk about some of the guys that we've lost and some of the guys that are still available for the BC Lions. So we're going to start, Blake, with the guys that we have lost because that is official. I guess actually I keep saying it's official, but
It's not. Yeah, it's not yet.
they have only agreed to terms. So as of
Couple
now, these
guys
guys
did
have
that
agreed.
last year where they pivoted.
They have, yes. And I guess we can start actually with the one official name that we know will not be back, and that is Bo Lacumbo, linebacker for the BC Lions, and probably a good opportunity, Blake, for you and I just to give Bo his flowers, give him a shout out for everything that he's done for the organization, everything that he's done for the community, for the province of BC. Obviously, still doing all the community work for the BC Lions and all the bystander presentations that they do in all the different schools across the province. So, just a big hat tip to Bo. Salute to a guy that I became familiar with, Blake. I know that my dad lived in Abbotsford and grew up going over there to visit and stuff like that. And my cousins went to WJ Mowat there in
Yep.
Abbotsford, and I remember being a little kid and going over there, and we'd watch Sunday football and whatnot, and we'd go to a BC Lions game or two, and from time to time they'd always mention about this Bolacumbo guy in grade 12 that's this nasty football player and he's going to be big one day and he's going to the pros. And I was like, man, like who the heck is this guy? Like I have no idea who this guy's going to be. And then I remember him going to Oregon and then being like, man, he's going to Oregon. Like how cool is that? Because I remember playing NCAA with him and we'd all the different Oregon uniforms and being like, man, like that's freaking really cool. And following his career along, and he got a little bit of a cup of coffee in the NFL, and then he comes back and getting to watch him. And I'll never forget. Obviously, it was for the BC Lions side of things. Probably we were on the wrong side of things, but his hit when he was with Montreal playing safety was just something that I'll never forget, and a clip that I'll never forget as well. So just a big salute to Bo for a hell of a career, and I'm sure we'll see him at BC Place, and this won't be the last
Oh, yeah.
time we'll see him around and doing community work, with the Lions crest on. So, Blake, is there anything that you want to maybe say to Bo one last time?
Yeah, no, it was just thank you, Bo, first and foremost. I wasn't as close with Bo as you were mentioning, but I did get a chance to meet Bo very briefly last year when me, Alex, and Steve, of course, from the Piffles podcast, we did our Eastern trip. The Lions were, of course, in Ottawa that week, the game that we were at, and we had gone to a little kind of hole in the wall restaurant. And sure enough, Bo Lacumbo was there with his, I believe it was his mother and some of his other family, just having lunch. And he was super welcoming, super willing to have a chat. It was very unfortunate that Bo just couldn't crack the lineup last year for a lot of the season due to injuries for the most part. And then when he was healthy, due to numbers. But it was just a treat to have him in BC for so long. And as you said, I'm sure possibly myself a little bit more than you, still staying involved in high school football. I'm sure I'll see Bo quite often out at either the high school field or out at BC Place.
That Moet New West rivalry, I'm sure you'll see him a couple times.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a few others that we have lost. Um, to negotiate or to agreeing to terms so far. There is actually a few guys that we have straight up release and let them go. And let's start with Alex Hollins, Kent Perkins,
Mhm.
receiver Alex Hollins, and offensive lineman Kent Perkins. Two guys that have been very meaningful contributors to the BC Lions. Alex Hollins, I think, deserves probably some flowers as well. Been with the team dating back to 2022 with Nathan Work, but I will remind folks he was on the practice roster back then. So a guy that we kind of, a diamond in the rough, if you will, that we found and were able to develop into something. And I think there is that level of play we saw Alex Hollins to start the year. I think there's still a little bit left in the tank towards
Yep.
for that level of play for Alex Hollins. I don't know if he can get quite back to that level of play for a consistent 18 game long regular season into the playoffs. It was reported that he had both knees scoped last year, and a tough thing to kind of do and um, stay healthy and get stay at your form that you were previous to. Obviously, when he kind of was healthy to start the year, and we saw those 200 and whatever 250-yard games against Winnipeg, and
Yeah.
he was going off to start the year and had a very very tough second half of the year. But I think you could argue a lot of that was to do with the knee injuries. My concern would be those knee injuries going forward. It wasn't only one knee, it was both knees that got scoped. A problem that is, as a receiver, you need those to run, to get open, to run routes. So a bummer for Alex Hollins. Ultimately, I think he'll land on his feet. I wouldn't be surprised if he lands in a place like Calgary. Ken Perkins, another guy who just a meaningful contributor, right tackle for the BC Lions for I want to say 3 or 4 years now. A guy that just quietly went about his business. Yes, there was some bad, but there's also a lot of good in there as well. I'm curious to see where Kent Perkins lands because he is a starting caliber player in my mind as well. And I think there'll be a team that looks to add him to the roster and look to maybe there's some right tackle spots that aren't open, but maybe they add him and he's able to get into a competition with somebody in a training camp. So there's going to be four other names that we lost. Three of them I think are fairly significant. One is maybe a depth guy that's I think going to be an interesting piece, and we're going to start with Manny Rigumba, Blake, defensive back. Another versatile piece, and I think this is a guy that I made a little bit public on social media. I think is a very underrated player in the CFL, and a guy that has played, Sam for us, has played, halfback, played a little bit of free safety, if I can remember correctly, his first year
Mhm.
in the CFL. Very quiet, another guy that just kind of goes about his business, punches the clock. He made that transition over to the boundary half this year. Playing a little bit of Sam, that Sam linebacker position. Obviously, TJ Lee, the normal starting boundary half, had missed until what was it, week 7 or 8. Manny Rugamba kind of transitioned to that position and played pretty well. And when TJ came back, he kind of tried to play out at boundary half a little bit and ended up taking over that Sam position. And they kind of just switched roles a little bit. I think Manny Rugamba is going to be a player that is, people are talking Edmonton right now of, Terrell Ford and Royce Metchie, and rightfully so. Those guys are very good. But I think Edmonton fans are going to be like, man, this Rugamba guy is really exciting to watch. I think you can
Mhm.
attest to he really brings the energy with the crowd and stuff like that. He likes to
Yeah.
interact with them and stuff like that, and will be a very good vibes guy for that organization. Another one that you and I were able to have on the channel last season, we're able to have a little bit of connection with. Shout out to AG. Actually gave me his gloves. I use them every Monday nights for Flag League. But Adrian Green leaving the BC Lions, national player. I think you and I were both, not even you and I, the organization was much higher on him going into this year. And I think expectations maybe got in the way of maybe Adrian maybe living up to those. And hopefully he's able to turn off the noise and really get back to that level of play that I think you and I and that the organization thought he was going to get to this past season, excuse me, where we were hearing rumblings of all-star caliber type player that he was going to be breaking out, and I just don't think we saw that this past year of him getting up to that level of play,
No.
which is unfortunate. I think some things were out of his control, but also there was some things that he I think could have done better as well. But another one, Blake, that I think is a more of a depth guy, but I think he is an underrated player in the CFL as a whole because he wasn't used as much in Montreal, but he's more known for, of course, the CFL's most weirdest gimmicky rule that I think is out there: the onside punt. Jeshurun Antwi, running back, he goes back to Calgary where he played his university football. Um, I think he's a guy that quietly, if he gets his opportunity, can be a contributor. Most importantly, he's a four-phase special teams guy where he's a Canadian player. He's going to be able to contribute on special teams for you and be a reasonable contributor. He's not just a guy that you throw out there and just because he's Canadian. Lastly, Blake, because I think the guy that's going to be I'm going to miss the most, and I think has probably the most upside is Josh Archibald, national defensive end, who we saw start the season. He broke out the season like gangbusters, man. He had I think 3 or 4 sacks to start last season, had a bigger role with the team. Pete Robertson kind of was hurt, and we didn't have Matthew Betts quite yet. Pete Robertson comes back from injury. Matthew Betts comes back from the NFL. He saw his snaps just kind of get dwindled down towards the end of the season. Obviously, Shona Tama plays meaningful snaps as well, and Archibald wasn't able to see the same production that he started the season off, which was a little bit of a bummer because I think he was going to be another diamond in the rough guy that the BC Lions were able to find. But Blake, with those names that we kind of mentioned, Lacumbo, Alex Hollins, Kent Perkins, Manny Rugamba, Adrian Green, Antwi, Archibald, is there any guys that maybe you just want to talk about and are just kind of a little bit bummed that they're not going to be in a BC Lions jersey?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bummed that Alexander Hollins will not be back with the BC Lions. I do understand why it happened. It was a little weird. It almost happened twice, where the Lions also flat out released Keon Hatcher as well, and then for whatever reason, maybe he wasn't happy with what other teams were offering him, or so on and so forth. Keon Hatcher actually did, as we already mentioned, re-signed with the Lions. But yeah, it's definitely a little upsetting to see Alexander Hollins not going to be back with the Lions. It is definitely a numbers game. They obviously weren't going to be able to keep all their receivers, as I would be willing to argue that they had 6 or 7 receivers for just 5 receiver spots. Name like Javon Katoy. The Lions, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, they're still negotiating with him. He is not quite under contract yet. So Javon Katoy, Justin McInnis, we already talked about. Keon Hatcher, a guy like Aiden Eberhardt, who is under contract, who, if he gets his opportunity, I think can be a full-time CFL receiver. So it really was just a numbers game, but it's unfortunate that someone would have to leave. And as it turns out, it had to be the Batman, which it is too bad because other than Rugamba, he was the one that probably brought the most energy to BC Place once Lucky Whitehead left. He was the one that kind of picked up the slack, if you will, with all the entrances and throwing up the bat signal after touchdowns and stuff like that. But I wish Alexander the Hollins all the best. I don't believe, at least I haven't heard that he signed anywhere else. So I do hope that he catches on somewhere in the CFL. But if he decides to go elsewhere with his life, as you said, with the injuries that he put up with last year, I wish him all the best. And it is definitely sad to see him leave.
All right, Blake, 3 more questions for you, buddy. Hopefully you can stick around. I know you got some
Yep.
other stuff that you got to go to. 3 more things, Blake, and we're going to start with the BC Lions current still available can re-sign until I think Sunday at 12 something, I think is when the
Yep.
negotiations cut off until Tuesday. And then it's basically a free-for-all. Teams are going to be able to start coming in like vultures and picking your current available free agents away. And we're going to start with some big names, Blake, on this list, man. There's some heavy hitters in terms of guys that are, big roles in that locker room, voices and leaders on this team. So let's start with one TJ Lee, David Mackey, Suk Chung, Josh Banks, Stefan Flintoff, just to name a few guys that are still available. Blake, this is a tough conversation. I'm going to, unfortunately, because there's a good teaser coming up, leave this for off camera to tell you. But I think there is a little nugget, and I would urge people to stay tuned in until JC Abbott joins us with one of these players coming up. Now, Blake, where I'm going to turn this back over to you, buddy. If you're GM for the day, if Ryan McMaden says, Blake, you're calling the shots, who are you bringing back to the BC Lions for one more year? Out of that list, who does it come to mind, Blake?
Does it have to be one, or can it be more than one?
I mean, let's go with a one, and then let's go with a 1B to tie into the Justin McInnis. Who's your number one, and then who's the guy that
Okay.
you would love as well?
So I would say my number one that you have to bring back is David Mackey. I mean, we already talked about Swiss Army knives. To me, David Mackey is that Swiss Army knife. He can be used as a running back in an absolute emergency situation. He was the Lions' short yardage quarterback at the end of the season, and did wonderfully at that. Even scored a couple touchdowns. And as a fullback, he has been an absolutely great blocker. So I would say that David Mackey is my number one. My number 1B on that list would probably be TJ Lee. I mean, maybe a bit of recency bias. He was on the Arrow Up documentary, but it doesn't look like he's slowed down. Like, especially after the injury last year. Maybe it was a bit of rough start coming out of the gates, but he really picked it up near the end of the season. And I think the Lions would do well to bring TJ Lee back. So David Mackey would be my one. TJ Lee would be my 1B.
I love it, Blake. I'm going to say nothing else until we hit end recording, and I will spill all the beans off camera to you. Until then, let's continue to get going forward here because we need to close things out. Blake, one last signing discussion talk before we get into wrapping this thing up. James Butler is coming back to
He
BC, and I
is.
think a
The
lot of
Butler
BC
did
Lions
it.
fans, shit, the Butler did it is right. I think a lot of BC Lions fans share the same excitement that Blake and I did. I was talking with JC Abbott about this, of, a very similar style back to William Stanback, where they are both can contribute out of the backfield, catching the ball, are very good at running the ball. I think where William Stanback is probably a little bit better is running the ball. Where I think this separates is just James Butler is a better out of the backfield, and they can
Yeah.
get him involved. That's where Nathan Rourke loves to involve the running back. I think a guy like Buck Pierce calling the shots will be able to get James Butler back to that 2022 form where we saw him really be just. Nathan Rourke was obviously getting a lot of the headlines and talk and praise, rightfully so. But if we look back at a lot of those games, Blake, like James Butler was a lot of the time like the straw that stirred the drink, or like maybe the engine. I don't know what the right term would be, but he got this team going a lot of the times. Where I think back to that 3 touchdown game versus Edmonton and a few games like that, where he was just really a dynamic player for us, not only running the ball but out of the backfield, getting him the ball through the air. So James Butler is going to be back in a BC Lions uniform, and I am very excited about it. Blake, how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, I'm really excited as well. I didn't mind William Stanback last year, but I think he underperformed a little bit. I also believe that that wasn't really his fault. That was more the offensive coordinator, especially later on in the year when stuff didn't started to not go the Lions' way. They just kind of abandoned the run where they would go into games and they'd fall behind early, and then they would just abandon it and hope that either VA or Nathan, whoever was behind center, could get them out of the hole. But yeah, I think that William, as I said, underperformed a little bit. He might even admit that to you. But I'm really excited about the signing. James Butler, he definitely wanted out of Hamilton. There's no question about it. He was underutilized all year. We heard it all year from Hamilton fans that he started the season so well, and then he was scratched over and over, a healthy scratch for literally no reason, or at least none that came out publicly. And that rubbed not only Butler not only Butler the wrong way, but a lot of Tiger Cats fans as well. So it's very clear that James Butler has not lost a step. And as you mentioned, he is very good at catching the ball out of the backfield. And that is the one thing that's different from VA to Rourke, is that VA doesn't throw the ball out of the backfield very often to the running back. Nathan does. And you definitely could tell later on in the season that for whatever reason, Nathan and Stanback couldn't get back on the same page. So I'm very excited for what Butler can do this year.
All right, Blake, just to tie a nice little bow on things, a few other names of the BC Lions have signed as well. A former defensive lineman from the Hamilton Tiger Cats, Dwayne Hendricks, coming over to the BC Lions. National receiver, guy I'm actually familiar with. He played his football or started playing football at John Barsby, just blocks away from where I'm recording this right now. Went to John Barsby, got to play against him when he went to Carson Graham. Then he ended up going down to Chaminade College Prep in California. Ended up, I think, at UW, Washington Huskies, and New Mexico State, and then had a little bit of an opportunity in the NFL. Came back, played with the Saskatchewan Roughriders for a little bit, and then, of course, um, actually, last year, I don't think he was on a team last year. I think he was actually a free agent, if I'm not mistaken. I would imagine there's some familiarity there with the BC Lions. Neil McAvoy obviously still involved in the front office role, probably dating back to Neil McAvoy having some familiarity with Braid Lennis in the lower mainland area, and
Yep.
a name that they're probably going to bring on. And probably not a guy that I would urge you guys to get really familiar with, but a guy that is worth taking a flyer on, because if he does show up to camp and is very motivated to play, number one, he's a national ratio breaking receiver, and he's kind of in that mold of a Justin McInnis, where say a Justin McInnis or a Javon Katoy goes down, you have a guy that can kind of step up off the bench. He's a national. You don't have to mess around with your ratio. It's not going to be a plug and play or a very seamless transition. Or I don't know if Braden Lennis would hold up to the floor of Justin McInnis or Javon Katoy, but I think he is um, a professional caliber receiver, where he's going to come in and, if you leave him open, he's going to make a play. Don't leave him open. Don't underestimate him, because he's going to do his job. But I think a guy that's a very interesting one that I'm going to keep my eye on. Of they brought him in for a reason, and maybe he's able to make the most of his opportunity. We will see. And another name that the BC Lions have signed as well is Trey Crawford, another defensive lineman with CFL experience. And as you mentioned, Keon Hatcher is going to be coming back after that weird situation. I would wonder if he actually even kind of got to test the temperature of the market, with it only being the negotiation period, or if he was just like, man, I got to just go back to BC here. Keon Hatcher was released from the BC Lions and then brought back on a restructured contract. So good to see Hatch coming back, and I think hopefully with another offseason under his belt, he will be able to get back up to the same form we saw him in 2023 before the Achilles injury, and even 2022 as well. The very, very elite form. So Blake, I think that's going to tie pretty much a bow on things here tonight. As always, of course, we go longer than anticipated. Talked about the re-signings. We talked about the signings. We talked about the trades. We talked about the losses from the BC Lions, and we talked about who is currently still available for the BC Lions to re-sign and bring back to the BC Lions. Blake, my last question for you, buddy, and for our listeners, and can be a quick one. You don't have to give too much of your thoughts because it's still a long time away, but we finally got the schedule since the last time we recorded,
We
and I
did,
think that
yeah.
is obviously an exciting time. We were waiting quite a long time for it. But something that ties into, for me, obviously that's super cool, is that we saw I'm not going to say return of Touchdown Pacific, but the BC Lions are going to be coming back over to Vancouver Island for a preseason game. And I think
Yeah.
this is a great opportunity to blend Touchdown Pacific coming over to the island with a preseason game, because I know the concerns of maybe coming back were, I would imagine, the just lack of revenue from a game like that, where you're
Yeah.
basically you're going into a smaller stadium, you're not able to fill it up as much as BC Place, you're cutting your revenue in probably half, or maybe even more, 60%, something like that. The venue was just not ready for the amount of people that were
No.
there. I know me and you talked about
No.
it quite a bit of times. Of the drink lines and food lines were absolutely ridiculous. Going to
Not nearly
Victoria for
enough merch.
Yes. Going to Victoria for another game, I was very bummed, to be honest, to see that they weren't coming back for Touchdown Pacific, for obviously selfish reasons, because I understand from a professional standpoint, stuff that I just mentioned, it just doesn't make sense from a owner's perspective, from a team's perspective, where you're trying to, increase revenue, all that sort of stuff. I understand. Coming back for a preseason game, I think is a fantastic idea where you're going to tie it into a guy like Jalen Philpott and try to build around him of, a local kid in BC here coming back to BC to play in a game. And the venue is much better than Royal Athletic Park in terms of, I think maybe it's going to still deal with some of those problems in terms of drink lines and stuff like that, but just the venue overall is in much better shape and in much newer condition. I think it holds 6K capacity as of now. I would imagine there's going to be some uh, temporary seating that gets put in to maybe
Yeah.
up it to like maybe 8 or 9K. I don't think they're going to try to get to 10K, or maybe they do. But it being a preseason game in Vancouver, they probably Blake, you can attest to this. They
Yeah.
just don't get attended well enough, anyways. In general, preseason games, right? So coming over to the island for a situation like this, you're going to get that draw because the average Joe CFL fan is obviously they might care about a preseason game, but they're just going to go just because it's an event and they want to see a CFL game in their city, stuff like that. And obviously, we're going to get the Elliott Mooses of the world and stuff like that, CFL fans that Elliott now former mainlander, I believe is an islander now, if I'm not
He
mistaken,
is.
lives
Yeah.
in Victoria. Guys that are going to be loyal to the CFL that will buy tickets just because they love the CFL and they're going to support it. I know there's some other guys. I believe it's Sean Ritchie and a few other of those guys that are in Victoria that are Argos fans and CFL fans that are just going to be there to support regardless. So I'm curious, Blake, as a kind of a big question. You can kind of take this as a bird's eye view question of the schedule and coming back for the preseason game. What are your overall thoughts? I know you were very boisterous online on Twitter of when that damn schedule is coming out. How are you feeling now that the schedule is coming out? I know you were also very excited because you, with that schedule coming out, you have the right to be exciting because you always plan your trips that are upcoming in the CFL season. So, Blake, how are you feeling now that we officially have a CFL schedule to look forward to, buddy?
Yeah, no, I'm feeling very excited. I was also a little surprised about the preseason game. It was kind of dropped out of nowhere. I talked to our friend Shane, and he has some sources in the CFL, and he had mentioned that before the schedule officially dropped, of course we couldn't mention it beforehand, but that there would be no touchdown game period this year. We had touchdown Atlantic before, of course, touchdown Pacific. He had said there wouldn't be any of those this year. So I was surprised by the Starlight game, and I think it's just a great date. I don't know if I can personally make it work just because of how my work schedule is, personally. But for regular people, it's a great time as well. I believe it's going to be like a 1 o'clock kickoff or something like that. And it's the Victoria Day, the May long weekend. So people don't even have to take a day off work. They can take a 9 a.m. ferry or an 8 a.m. ferry or whatever. If they're from the mainland, get over to the island by 10 o'clock, go to Starlight, watch the game by 4, take the 6 o'clock ferry and be home by 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. So I think it's a great chance for the BC Lions. Personally, I'm very excited by the schedule because there's actually a Lions game on my birthday this year. That very
Oh, hell yeah,
rarely
buddy!
happens. So they are
What
in
what what
Ottawa.
what? Oh, they're in Ottawa. Okay.
They're in Ottawa, yeah. So it is an away game. So I'm hoping to make that work. And then this year it didn't work out with the trip that I had planned with my other buddies. But I'm hoping to go back to Winnipeg for the Banjo Bowl. That's the same weekend. So maybe a bit of a extended birthday weekend. But yeah, definitely excited to have a Lions game on my birthday. I as long as I can remember being a fan, I don't think that's ever happened. So it's definitely something to look forward to.
Heck yeah, buddy. I'm excited for you. That's super cool. Obviously, with mine being in January, that's not possible to happen. But every once in a while, there's a Buffalo Bills game on my birthday, and man,
Yeah.
it's just like obviously if they win, it's so much fun. If they lose, it's like a little bittersweet, but it's still really cool to kind of enjoy your favorite team on your birthday and just have a good time. So I hope that works out for you, buddy. And Shane, if you're listening, hopefully you have a spot on the couch for for Blake. But Blake. lastly, buddy, I heard you mention the ferry and saying, people could get home by 6, 7 o'clock. Talk about your experience. You probably get home by like 8, 9 o'clock. I know you had some
Yeah,
difficult times with the Vancouver Island ferry. You weren't impressed, but jokes aside, buddy, I think that's gonna do it here for us. As I said off camera, 30 minutes turns into an hour. That's kind of typical of us here on the Canadian
it
Football
is.
Fanatics. So, um, thanks for joining me, buddy. As always, I enjoyed it as we always do, talking Canadian football, CFL, and most importantly, the BC Lions. As I've said, we're going to throw things over to the JC episode right now. He joins me for about half an hour. We talk about, the Ryan Rigmaiden, Buck Pierce kind of new regime. We also talk about Mike Benevides, and then we discuss kind of all the things me and Blake just discussed of the BC Lions moves in free agency. We also discuss a few other things. We talk about the rising cap, and I had to, throw this one in there because it's been quiet ever since it had been announced. It blew up when it first got announced at Grey Cup. Does he have any tidbits on who is our new commissioner? I will and say,
Ooh,
keep listening because it's coming shortly here from one JC Abbott. If you guys enjoyed today's video or mine and Blake's part of today's video, please be sure to leave a like, comment down below. Let us know if you guys enjoyed today's video. Comment down below what you guys enjoyed most about the BC Lions free agency so far, who you guys would like to see them sign, even how you guys have been enjoying the schedule coming out, and maybe a touchdown Pacific versus a preseason touchdown Pacific. And even if I know our good buddy Jay has been very excited to when the schedule came out narrow down when he was going to take off some time. Let us
he
know
was,
what game
yeah.
you guys are going to be attending this year, or maybe what trips you guys are looking forward to doing in your CFL upcoming season. Like Blake said, he's looking forward to a few of those trips, Ottawa, and I know he goes to a few other ones, Labor Days and stuff like that. So comment down below, let us know what you guys are looking forward to this CFL season. It can even be what you guys are looking forward to the CFL off season. I know Blake and I will be here along every step of the way, won't we, Blake? We will be covering
We will.
combine, invitational, national, you name it. Whenever the BC Lions make big signings, Blake and I will be back to break it all down. So, Blake, it was good to talk some BC Lions, buddy. It's been a little while. It's been I know you mean you and I talked with Nick a little while ago, but I was like I
We
said,
did.
look back at that offseason primer. It was 2 months ago now. We
I
talked BC
know.
Lions. So I'm excited to get back in the swing of things. Um, and it only is going to start picking up once Tuesday comes around. I think, like we were saying, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on February 11th. This will be uploaded on YouTube to you guys on February the 10th, on the Monday, the day before. Gives you guys the day to hopefully enjoy this, consume this before we get into the hustle and bustle of free agency. Obviously, everything will become official at 9 a.m. Pacific, our time. Blake, one last thing, and this is obviously not Canadian football, Blake, but obviously this is some of the biggest days of the year for football. Super Bowl Sunday. By the time you're listening, this it just happened, so we are gonna know who has won. Blake, as painful as this is for me to say, I'm gonna
Yeah.
take the Kansas City Chiefs. But Blake, give us your predictions. Who do you got winning the Super Bowl yesterday? By the time people are listening to this, so we're gonna know who won. But who do you got in the Super Bowl?
Yeah, I think this is really tough. I think the Chiefs are going to three-peat for the first time in NFL history. But if I go with my heart, I hate the Eagles a little bit less than I hate dynasties. So I will be cheering for the Eagles in the game, but I think the Chiefs are going to three-peat.
I like it, buddy. I like it. So, that will do it for Blake and I right now for BC Lions. Like I said, we're not too sure what we're going to call this episode. Stay tuned. But BC Lions free agency discussion, extravaganza, frenzy, you name it. We're basically breaking down all of the BC Lions moves here leading into free agency. Let's send it right now to 3DownNation's JC Abbott. Alrighty, fanatics. Joining me now is one JC Abbott from 3DownNation. JC, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Thanks for having me on. I'm doing great.
Awesome, man. Exciting times. I know you were just mentioning off camera, kind of gets to that point in the year, sneak in a little bit of vacation time, and then free agency comes up, sneaks upon us, and it's almost like, back into CFL mode, back into football mode. I am very, very excited. obviously after free agency, the combine and whatnot. I know you do a great job covering that stuff. And actually, as we're on that topic, JC, first and foremost, big time shout out to you and everybody that contributes over that 3Down Nation. You guys have been doing a fabulous job over the last week or so, just covering it, producing all your guys' content coverage and stuff like that. Just really, really appreciative for all your guys' work, man. And maybe just give us a little plug of what you've been doing. I know John Hodge has been very busy with kind of keeping on updates for the teams and whatnot. And of course, Justin Dunk, hard worker as well.
Yeah, it's a complete team effort for us. It's all hands on deck as soon as the free agency window opens. We're in constant communication back and forth. We have a little WhatsApp group chat between the three of us where we hash it all out and give each other instructions or things we're hearing. Obviously, people have different connections, different sources, so we're able to work together to find out details for stories and figure out what needs to be prepped, what's about to break, that type of thing. Of course, I'm the guy on the West Coast. Everyone else is a little bit further east. So I wake up a little bit later than everybody else. I usually have about 40 to 60 messages waiting for me when I wake up in the morning this time of year with everything going on with free agency. So there's a lot of action, a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes, conversations and prep work that we have to do to produce the content that hopefully you all enjoy.
Yes, I saw you guys talking about it on the podcast this week. We got to handicap you since you're 3 hours behind. All the guys are breaking news before you. But JC, like I was saying, just kind of wanted to get you on here before free agency officially starts to talk about the BC Lions. Not too sure what we're going to call this. BC Lions free agency extravaganza. I don't think it's a preview, so kind of just going to break down free agency and maybe take a little bit of a bird's eye view approach from the BC Lions perspective. And I might have to sneak in a few extra league-wide questions at the end. But before we get kind of up to time, I want to rewind things a little bit. And I know obviously you probably talked about this on your platform many times and have made your opinion known. But I'm curious just to go back to kind of the new regime that is in BC now with Ryan Rigmain and Buck Pierce obviously at the helm. What are just your overall quick thoughts on kind of the new regime here going forward?
Well, it's certainly an exciting time. I wasn't necessarily in the camp that believed that a change had to be made after last season. I said many times, I think Rick Campbell, his record and his pedigree deserved another opportunity, but clearly with the investment that Amar Doman made last season and not getting the returns, somebody had to fall on that sword and it created that shakeup. But the Lions, I think, have done a good job creating, at least at the top, something for fans to get excited about. Buck Pierce has been talked about as a top head coaching candidate for the last number of years now. I think he's a brilliant offensive mind, and that's something that could very much benefit Nathan Rourke as he looks to get back to his true form this season. And then Ryan Rigmain taking over as the official GM, I think that's a move. Promoting a guy within that you want to retain in your organization who is highly qualified, who has had interest across the league, and was somebody who was going to get this job eventually. I think he's already been putting his stamp on this team. He has a great relationship with players south of the border, has been so effective in that scouting role, which he'll continue to do in his GM duties. So I'm excited about it. The coaching staff itself, all fleshed out. I think it was maybe a little bit more underwhelming than some of the other staff changes across the league. You see what's happening in Edmonton and you get really excited about some of the young prospects there, but there's a lot of experience with this BC Lions staff. So I think they'll be able to hit the ground running. It's certainly not going to be a team that takes a step back next year.
Just one more on the coaching staff, JC, with defensive coordinator being announced, it being Mike Benevides. I'm curious on, obviously people in BC are well aware of him being with the BC Lions, defensive coordinator, special teams, former head coach in the past history. I'm curious, I kind of had my takes and thoughts on this and thought Ryan Phillips maybe kind of got a little bit shorthanded with kind of how his group performed and maybe would have liked to see him, as you alluded to with Rick Campbell, maybe given another opportunity. Now, obviously, he stays on the staff. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on Mike Benevides getting the promotion and kind of that dynamic? I'm sure Ryan Phillips looks up to Mike Benevides, coached him, will work in tandem together. What do you think of that dynamic and that transition?
It's certainly an interesting one. And I'll start with the Benevides point. He's a guy that I have tremendous respect for. I think he's somebody who deserved more opportunities in this league, and the guy who, frankly, deserves another opportunity at some point to be a head coach down the line, because he got himself a little bit shortchanged during his go around in BC as the bench boss. But when it comes to Ryan Phillips, we're talking about a guy who, if we were having this conversation this time last off season, we would say he's one of the most exciting young defensive minds in the CFL, a potential head coaching candidate. To go from there to being demoted to a position coach, to me is a little bit harsh, especially given what he had to deal with last season. Not a lot of pass rush up front, a constantly cycling secondary. Those were personnel issues. Those weren't coaching issues from Ryan Phillips. And I think he would be leading a top-notch defense if he had the talent to do so once again. I don't have any belief that these two guys are going to clash in sort of this awkward reshuffling, because, as you mentioned, they have a great relationship. They've worked together previously. Benevides coached Phillips back in the day. But it's still awkward when you've got the former defensive coordinator there and the new defensive coordinator. At the end of the day, when a decision has to be made and players are looking to somewhere for answers, which one of those two guys are they going to look to? And we know part of this was that Ryan Phillips was the only member of Rick Campbell's staff who was under contract for this upcoming season. So they didn't want to let him walk because that would have hurt them against the coaching cap. So does he see this as just one more year in BC and then he's going somewhere else? Or does he see this as long-term? Because you open yourself up to other possibilities there as well, in terms of, guys following him afield, his focus maybe drifting, even though I know he's a highly focused guy and somebody who you would trust with that responsibility. We're all human, right? And when you're looking for your next opportunity, sometimes that can take away from your current one. So I don't know how he sees that role right now. And it's going to be interesting to see how the players react to that dynamic more than the two men involved, because ultimately they are going to be looking for someone to lead them. And it'll be interesting to see which voice they respect more.
Yes, it's going to be a very interesting dynamic to see how it unfolds next season. So, JC, let's get into, like I said, I'm not too sure what we're going to call this. Free agency breakdown, preview. It doesn't sound right. Extravaganza, maybe. Let's talk specifically, though, about the BC Lions. And I'm going to quickly bring up, like I said, you guys do a fabulous job, JC, over at 3Down Nation. You guys can go over there, and John Hodge actually has an article up for basically every team's signings, trades, all their transactions that have been made this offseason, JC. And obviously I don't want to go through all of them, but I do want to start with a few kind of more important ones. And like I said, we're going to maybe start a little farther back than some of the signings that we've been seeing this last week or so. But I want to start with the Matthew Betts signing. I made it kind of very clear on our platform here of maybe tending to lean towards a re-signing and bringing him back, just because of the price that it would come at. And I think the I guess handcuffing of what you're able to do in free agency, the holes that you're able to fill. I know you mentioned on the podcast this week of, you've liked what the BC Lions have done this past 7 days, but there is still some holes in that roster. And I think when you sign some of these guys, obviously Nathan Work, we can talk about him, and Justin McInnis is getting paid top tier dollars. That's going to handcuff you, like I mentioned, in some areas. What are your overall thoughts on the contract? And just, I know there's also some some people in the fan base of, are we going to see him back up to that level in 2023 that we did see him? So what are your just overall thoughts and just expectations, I guess, for Betts?
I've always been a big Matthew Betts believer, so I think he's worth the money with this massive deal. I think he'll get back to the form he had in 2023 before he went to the NFL. We all know, we see it every year. It's difficult for guys. You'd think they'd be in full game shape coming off an NFL training camp, but there are different demands on your body preparing for the NFL than preparing for the CFL. You're at a different stage in the year, and it's not as simple as just stepping in and hitting the ground running. It takes time for a lot of these guys who get cut in NFL training camps, and I think it took a little bit of time for Betts. But at his peak, he is a ratio-breaking Canadian pass rusher unlike any other, and I've always seen him that way. And yes, paying a premium for that is going to limit you in other spots, but I just don't think that there were a ton of other guys that you could have gotten around the league. Yes, there were good pass rushers available, but a lot of those people were following guys that they had connections with or would have demanded similar dollars to Betts in order to bring over. There wasn't a lot of other ways you could juice up that pass rush. Banking on Betts coming back to his 2023 form, I think is a smart move, especially because of the ratio implications, right? You are paying a premium because it's also a Canadian position, and they've built themselves well to do that.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how things happen. I think part of my argument of kind of why I wanted to, I think Christian Covington quietly had a pretty
Mm.
decent season last year, and I think similar to him, of the guys that go to NFL training camps and don't really adjust as quickly as I think fans would like. I think Covington is similar to that, and he spoke to that actually during season. You might have even been in some of the press availabilities of him mentioning of like not really expecting how fast and quick the game was up here, and kind of adjusting that yard off the ball. My thinking was kind of understanding how great Matthew Betts is, maybe leaning more into Christian Covington, hopefully gaining some another level next year, and hopefully, obviously, there was only so many names in free agency. Hoping to find maybe a next guy that can kind of fill in a younger type contract. That being said, I think you make some very good points, and Betts being a Canadian, a ratio breaker, and hopefully seeing him get back up to form will be a nice, easy way to see the contract moving forward. But let's get into JC, the trade a few weeks ago with Toronto and Dejon Allen getting shipped over for Ryder Varga and a draft pick. What were just your overall thoughts when you seen that come through?
Well, I mean, it's a massive deal as far as CFL trades go. We've seen a couple of them this offseason, but Roger Varga, I think, is a future full-time starter in this league, a player I loved in the draft. I've loved in his first few years in BC, but we know what the problem has been with this team offensively the last number of years, right? It's been inconsistent offensive line play dating back to the times when Michael Riley was laying on his back behind that front, right? It's gotten better at stages. They've been able to work their way around it with different offensive systems, but ultimately they needed to get better up front. And Dejon Allen is as good as it gets in this league when it comes to tackle play. He is a legitimate lockdown guy on that right side. You pair him with Jarrell Broxton on the other side. Your Canadians allow you to potentially start 3 Americans on the offensive line there. So I think that is a fantastic move for this team when you want to protect Rourke and allow him to get comfortable in this new offense and work through his progressions in the pocket like he showed he was able to do in 2022, to not have the inconsistencies that Kent Perkins showed at that right tackle position. He had some good games too, don't get me wrong, and there was a lot of promise early on in his career, but there are also some real stinkers, and you're not going to get those types of games from Dejon Allen. He is well worth the cost in my mind.
Yeah, and I think he also brings over that championship pedigree that they've been building over there in Toronto, and adding that to the locker room, I think will be pay dividends as well. So I'm curious, JC, on how you guys. I know you guys were talking about the Justin McInnis deal, and I think it was Justin that mentioned of liking the contract and liking the deal. Obviously, Canadian receiver again, kind of ratio breaker. I believe you guys were having the conversation of wanting to see this again, and maybe a conversation of maybe having to prove himself of being that
Mm.
bona fide number one receiver versus maybe he's a very good number two, or that 1B to a 1A that he needs somebody beside him. How do you feel about the contract number one, and do you think he's going to be able to live up to that expectations, especially now that we've seen Alex Holland's released? We did get Hatcher coming back, but all eyes are going to be on him when teams are studying film the week leading into the BC Lions. It's going to be all on Justin McInnis, and trying to take him away from the offense. So what are your thoughts overall on that deal?
My thoughts are probably in retrospect when we get to the end of this contract, we'll think of it as a little bit of an overpay because I don't see Justin McInnis as a guy who's going to lead the CFL in receiving yards year after year. But considering what receivers have made the last number of years, and even a guy like Kenny Lawler is going to make more than Justin McInnis next season, it's not crazy money. And I still think McInnis is going to be a very high-end Canadian option in your offense for as long as he's there, especially if you're able to scheme him into the situations where he excels, right? Jordan Maksimic was able to do that for long stretches of the season. There were other games where he was largely taken away. I think Buck Pierce is going to be diving deep into that film to figure out the best way to utilize him next year, considering he will be, for all intents and purposes, their number one because he is paid like it. And this offense is going to run through him from a passing perspective. It's going to be interesting to see because I think overall the talent level of the receiving core probably took a little bit of a step back through these offseason moves. Obviously, having to part ways with a guy like Alexander Hollins, who had his problems, but at his peak was absolutely electric. They're going to have to find somebody to replace those roles. Right now, Stanley Berryhill and Aiden Eberhardt are going to be relied upon to take that next step. Are they guys who can really seize that opportunity, or do they need to find somebody else through their scouting process or a bargain bin free agent to really take the top off the defense or open up space for McInnis? I would say that they do at this stage. There needs to be pieces added there to maximize his ability.
So a move I think a lot of people liked, but I was curious on kind of maybe your thoughts. James Butler coming back to BC, and the Lions were able to pick him back up from kind of the weird situation that he was dealing with in Hamilton of the inactive and whatnot. And I know you're very well aware of his talents and what he was able to do in a BC Lions jersey back in 2022, a few years ago. Um, I think one thing kind of they are very, I think, I find that they're kind of very similar backs in Stanback and James Butler. I think you could probably argue James Butler maybe is has a little bit better hands. I think the play that stands out to me that kind of separates them is that pick six to Saskatchewan where William Stanback a little swing pass towards the sideline and it kind of bobbled off his hands, ended up going the other way for Saskatchewan. I think James Butler, you rely on him a little bit more in the passing game. He's able to run hard downhill and as well as outside the tackles. What were your thoughts on bringing James Butler back to BC, JC?
I think most of all, it's a comfort move, right? Because William Stanback, I loved what he was able to do last year, but he was VA's guy from Montreal, right? That was the connection. Now VA is gone. Nathan Rourke is your guy going forward. So you bring back Rourke's guy from when he had that tremendous 2022 season. And I think Butler really played an underrated role in that season because he was so effective as an outlet out of the backfield. Stanback got a lot of usage as that last year, more than he ever has in his career, but I don't think it was necessarily the receiving role was necessarily something he was designed for or super comfortable with. James Butler is, right? He can be that check down option. He can be that safety valve or that release valve for Rourke throughout the season. And I think that bringing in somebody that your quarterback is comfortable with or more comfortable with is going to be a positive. Yes, he's also a year younger, maybe has a little bit more juice overall. Those are the hopes. I think largely on the running the football side, it's going to be a negligible improvement, but you're going to add a little bit more in the passing game, and you're going to add a comfort and chemistry level to this offense that was clearly lacking when Rourke was under center last year. That makes a big difference.
Yeah. So quickly, JC. There's been some signings. It's crazy to think that free agency hasn't even really officially opened quite yet. But with those signings, I know you guys talked about it on the podcast as well. Where do you see this team still needing to improve? And maybe areas they can find in free agency. Obviously, they're going to have to maybe rely on Ryan Rigman to, use that scouting ability and find some of these Americans that are going to be first-time Canadians into this, or excuse me, first-time players into the CFL. Where do you see this roster still needing to improve?
Well, right now, when I look at it, I have some major questions, like I mentioned, at receiver. I think they need to add a piece there or find somebody there. I think the offensive line situation on the interior, I'll be intrigued to see where they are going with that. Michael Couture gets re-signed today. I'm not sure that Suk Chung is going to be back, and that's an area that I felt that they needed to improve anyway. Does that mean you're giving George Unga, your first round pick from last year, the run, or Tyler Packer the run at that right guard spot? Or is there somebody else that you're waiting for the market to settle to bring in? I think there are options out there. Biggest questions, though, I don't know who this team's strong side linebacker is right now, right? I think people slotted into everywhere else in the secondary, but I mean, I know Patrice Rene has played a number of different spots, but I don't see that as a long-term fit for him there. They've got to find a Sam, and there's not very many of them available out there that are experienced. And I also think that they need a backup quarterback. And we've seen what happens when quarterbacks go down in this league. We know how important it is to have a viable or top tier backup. And I know that they're high on Chase Bryce, but I really would like somebody to push him in training camp. Maybe you bring a guy like Shea Patterson in or somebody like that, somebody with a few starts under his belt. There's not a lot of super attractive options out there necessarily, but I think one of those guys will end up under contract with the Lions before it's all said and done, because they need some competition to find a suitable backup if, knock on wood, something were to happen to Rourke.
So not from a negative perspective, JC, but maybe who do you think will be, you mentioned of Ryder Varga and thinking that he's going to be a player down the line in his career of a starting caliber player. Who do you think might be one of the bigger losses for the BC Lions? I think of a guy like Josh Archibald, very underrated player, started the season broke it like gangbusters last year. I think it was like 3 or 4 sacks and was up there amongst the league. And then obviously his role and snaps started to kind of get pulled back a little bit. Manny Rugamba is another guy, I think, a very underrated player, a very versatile player as well. Who do you think maybe, and maybe just give it a chance to talk highly about another player for a second. Who do you think the Lions are going to miss out of some of these losses?
Yeah, I think Archibald is a guy that, of any of the losses, if I had a choice on who to retain, it would have been him, just because I feel like having him in behind Betts really solidifies that position for Canadians, and he has the potential to be a starting pass rusher in his own right. I think he will start games for the Alouettes next year, which is where he's agreed to terms. Unfortunately, I think just because teams saw him that way, he probably priced himself out of BC, but that is going to be sort of an underrated loss, if you will. And then looking around to other spots, I think another one that's up in the air right now is the status of David Mackey, right? Has yet to resign. I've heard whispers that maybe he's contemplating his future in pro football as a veteran. I don't know that for certain, but he has not resigned at this stage. And I think when you talk about underrated players on this BC Lions roster, you think of all the things he did, both as a special teamer, as a short yardage quarterback, as an inline tight end, doing all the different things he did. There are a few guys who were more valuable with less praise than David Mackey. And when he got hurt for a stretch last year, it really affected the Lions as a whole. I thought they did not recover well from his absence. So if he's not coming back, either joining another team or hanging it up, whatever it may be, then they're going to have to find somebody to fill that role, or obviously with a new offensive system, adapt so that role no longer exists, because he was hugely impactful for them.
Yes, very glad and very well said that you mentioned David Mackey. I think another thing of you mentioned his value just one of the biggest voices in that locker room as well. I'm sure you can attest to that, being around the players and being around the team. A friend of mine went to Western, played alongside David Mackey, was on the 2017 national champions with them. And I mentioned that dating back to his college days of how, we kind of saw it in the Arrow Up, how he comes out without his fiance and without his family, and he's always, around the teammates, and they're going out to, dinners and stuff like that. And I feel like that is a very underutilized, estimated kind of voice and leader on that team. So I'm curious to see what happens maybe in the coming days. So JC, a couple questions here before we get you out of here, non-BC Lions related. We got the big news the other day, and I know you guys had your opinions on the site as well, of the salary cap increase. I'm curious. I know there's a lot of directions, and there's also a lot of layers to this conversation, especially with the timing and whatnot. Just quickly, what are your thoughts on obviously it is a positive for the league, but just how the situation was handled, unfortunately, and just your overall thoughts.
Yeah, the timing of this sucks, right? Because it comes a little bit too late. Some of that is unavoidable just in the way that the league year is structured. Other parts of it, it's on the league for not getting the CFLPA proper documents fast enough, which they've been notorious for over the last little bit. And these salary cap increases were supposed to happen every single year when there's revenue growth. I believe that they've just skipped over 2024, which is my understanding of this, because they've been so late to the process. So um, there are ways that this could have been handled better. But overall, because the way that the CBA is structured, now that the cap has gone up, it can never go down again. So even if it doesn't necessarily help the guys who had already agreed to terms, in this early legal tampering window, it'll help them in a year from now. It'll help guys down the line because there will be more cap space going forward. So overall, it's a massive positive for the league. I know there's a lot of fans out there that are concerned that, well, we've had 3 days of all these, signings or announced, agreed to terms, and this is all this new money has arrived, and well, it's all going to go up in the air. And maybe they're excited that potentially they can attract some of their own players back, or they're fearful that they're going to lose some of these acquisitions. There may be some of that, but I think teams are still figuring out how to handle this new money, or waiting direction from their leadership and league leadership in terms of how it's going to be handled. And also, you have to remember, in this league, and this is a bit of hyperbole, but it's not far off. There's like 6 agents, right, who have real sway and power, and they have to deal with all 9 teams, and they represent, dozens of players each, all in negotiations. So if they're going around backtracking on their word, breaking deals that they've already shook hands on, that's going to potentially affect their business and their clients' business going forward. So nobody wants to do that. There may be the odd deal that gets redone, or the odd guy who's represented by himself or by a lone wolf agent who says, hey, I want more money, I'm out, I'm backtracking. But I think overall, most of the things that have been agreed to will stay in place going forward.
All right, JC, last one for you. I'm curious. This blew up when it first got announced, and now I feel like, been quiet because of all the agreed to terms. I want to keep saying it's signings, but you are correct. It is agreed to terms. Nothing is official quite yet. Do you have any insight on who might be the new commissioner of the CFL?
I don't have any insight on that whatsoever at this stage. It's certainly going to be a fascinating question. They're taking their sweet time with it. I wouldn't be shocked if we went into the start of next season with Ambrosi still in that seat. I know there were whispers and rumors that sort of hit our ears months before he actually stepped down, or announced he was going to step down, that one of the Ontario provincial cabinet ministers who resigned was potentially going to be the next commissioner of the CFL. I have no idea if that man has found a job in the private sector since, because again, it was months in between those whispers and when Randy Ambrosi announced his decision. And you'd think if there was an actual connection there, he would already be installed as commissioner. But since then, it's been incredibly quiet, and I think there's going to be, a lot of steps in this process before we actually get a decision made by the Board of Governors.
JC, I lied, but you were in attendance, I believe. Give me your thoughts on Taylor Elgersma and seeing him live in person.
Oh, yeah. I saw him down at the College Gridiron Showcase before he blew up and ended up at the Senior Bowl. This kid's different. He's special. He is a legitimate NFL tools guy. His arm strength is ridiculous. The ball whistles off his hands. He's the type of guy, when you're field level with 100 professional scouts milling about and he throws a pass, everybody's head turns. That's what Taylor Elgersma is like. Now he's got a lot to learn, right? Learning the American game. He's got an uphill battle. But I'm excited about what his future holds in terms of, potentially being a late round draft pick or a UDFA in the NFL. And I think if he ever comes up to the CFL, he is going to be a guy who could potentially be a starter down the line. I've had people tell me that there are 2 first-round quarterbacks in this year's CFL draft, him and Curtis Rourke, and I do not believe that the gap between them is as big as people might think, because one played at Laurier and one played at Indiana. I think if these 2 guys were reversed, you'd be talking about them differently. If Taylor had a brother who got him a scholarship down to Ohio and he was able to go down that path, I think you'd be talking about Taylor Elgersma as a guy leading teams to a college football playoff. He is that talented, and I'm glad to see him getting the attention that he deserves here.
Well, JC, thank you so much for jumping on the show tonight. If you guys enjoyed, please be sure to like the video, comment down below, and most importantly, subscribe. JC, before we get you out of here, let the people know where they can find your work, find you on social media, and of course, find all your work on 3Down.
Yeah, check me out. All my work's on 3DownNation, and you can find me at the JC Abbott on Twitter or X, whatever you call it now. I'm also on Blue Sky. I forget what I'm called on there. Give me a second. Just JC Abbott on Blue Sky. So if you've made the transition over from X, you can find me there as well.
Like I said, JC, we get after the holidays, we're almost like it's time to take a deep breath away from football, and then free agency is like thrown on your lap, and it's time to go all back into football mode again. So, like I said, JC, I appreciate everything you guys do at 3Down. It's very helpful to us, and all the coverage you guys give is just A1. So, like I said, JC, appreciate you as always jumping on here and talking some Canadian football. Please, guys, go over to 3Down. Let them know that you guys are a fan of them and all their great coverage. JC, thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
It's a pleasure as always.